Because let's be honest, we've had, legacy admissions is almost like a continuation of affirmative action for white people that we've had ever since the Mayflower came over.
And it's funny you say that, because according to an article in the Boston Globe titled "Boycott Targets College Admissions Boost Given to Children of Alumni at Harvard and Other Elite Schools," it's from the September 25th, 2021 article. It speaks to what you just said. The Boston Globe notes, and I quote, "College admissions preferences for alumni children are almost entirely a U.S. phenomenon with well-documented origins about a century ago, as Ivy League schools tried to limit the surging attendance by Jews and other immigrant populations. Today, about 3/4 of the country's most selective colleges consider applicants' legacy status in admissions. Because legacy students reflect the demographics of earlier graduating classes, they tend to be disproportionately white and affluent. According to the Ivy League schools data released themselves, legacies make up a sizable portion of the student body. And according to the Boston Globe, the proportions are as follows. 14% of the current freshman class at Yale, and this was in 2021, 13% at Dartmouth, 10% at Brown. A Harvard University spokeswoman declined to provide that information, but the student surveys by the Harvard Crimson found that an average of about 16% of the classes from 2018 to 2025 said they had at least one parent who attended Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
According to this article, at Harvard, the children of alumni are nearly 6 times more likely to be admitted than non-legacies, according to Harvard data released during an admissions lawsuit filed by Students for Fair Admissions and was analyzed by Duke University economist Peter Arcidiacono. In the classes of 2014 to 2019, Harvard alumni children were accepted at a rate of 33.6%, compared with 5.9% for non-legacies. What say you?
Yeah, we've had effectively affirmative action for white people from Plymouth Rock all the way until civil rights in the 1960s. Okay, so if your relatives went to Harvard sometime between now and then, and Harvard University is older than the country that it's in. Harvard University was founded in the 1600s. So your great grandfather, your great grandmother went to Harvard long before, or just your grandparents went to Harvard before we had full-on integration. And yes, Harvard started admitting Black students before Brown v. Board, but not that many.
Correct.
You are now benefiting from that because they still have legacy admissions.
Well, I'm proud to say that the New York State Senate has introduced a bill to combat that. It is called the Fair College Admissions Act, the Senate bill 4170, which would end the use of binding early decision admissions policies. It is also framed by its supporters as a response to the likely, and they were right, Supreme Court decision that would end or restrict the use of race in college admissions. And that is from the Forbes article posted May 10th of this year.
Yeah, and I give you a lot of credit because in a previous podcast, you pointed out that, yes, there's a lawsuit to try to get legacy admissions stopped, but the Supreme Court, it's not that the Supreme Court is going to vote to shut that down and say, no, we're going to keep legacy admissions. The Supreme Court just won't vote on it. They just won't take it. The Supreme Court gets to determine what cases they look at. So they just say, oh, this thing that we don't like, we're just not going to take it.
Correct.
Fuck you.
They don't have to. They have somebody who weeds out cases and presents them with the final kind of batch, if you will. And then from there, they weed out the ones that they find important to take. I don't know who makes that decision, if it's made as a collective team, if you will. But it's unfortunate that we can tell where everybody's leaning. And I find that a problem for both sides of the aisle. We should all have a problem with that, politics aside.
Yeah. Now let's go back to Berkeley real quick. Berkeley and UCLA, to their credit, after Prop 209, which got rid of affirmative action in the mid-90s, they got rid of their legacy programs.
Okay. And it's important to note that there was a precedent for that case as well. In 1978, there was the Regents of University of California versus BACKE, BAKKE case. The Supreme Court ruled that a university's use of racial quotas in its admissions process was unconstitutional, but a school's use of affirmative action to accept more minority applicants was constitutional in some circumstances. The case involved the admission practices of the Medical School of the University of California at Davis. The medical school reserved 16 out of 100 seats in its entering class for minorities, which included Blacks, Chicanos, Asians, and American Indians. The rigid admissions quota was administered by a special school committee. So 16 out of 100 available seats were reserved specifically for those who could, in addition to their qualifications, add minority. That is what is important to note, that these people still, if you will, had the requirements to throw their note in the hat. Alan Bach, a white applicant, was twice denied admission to the medical school, even though his MCAT scores, GPA, and benchmark scores were significantly higher than those of some minority applicants recently admitted. He sued the University of California in a state court, alleging that the medical school's admission policy violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The California Supreme Court agreed, finding that the quota system explicitly discriminated against racial groups and holding that no applicant may be rejected because of his race in favor of another who is less qualified as measured by standards applied without regard to race. The medical school ordered to shut down its quota system, appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which reviewed the case in 1978. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision written by Justice Powell, ruled that a state may constitutionally consider race as a factor in its university admissions to promote educational diversity, but only if considered alongside other factors and on a case-by-case basis.
I actually agree with that. I do not support any kind of a quota system.
Okay, speak to that.
I think quota systems are dumb.
So you're saying they should not have held the 16 spots out of the 100?
No. I think instead, if we want to have a racially diverse class when it comes to med school, since at that point where we're getting away from intended major and stuff like that, I mean, maybe they're looking at, okay, maybe do you want to do phlebotomy, pharmacology, you want to be an OBGYN? Maybe there's something in that realm, but it's still med school. Med school is still med school. Now, if you want to have racially diverse med school, you know what you can do? Let's make sure all students have access to training materials for the MCAT. And we can also help support a program where Black doctors can mentor Black undergraduate students that want to get into med school and stuff like that. Or maybe we can set up stuff where,
set up pipelines. So you want to set up a pipeline for equity.
Yeah, we can work on pipeline instead of having an outright quota system, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about med school, motherfucker, you better be able to do that med school shit. Okay, you better know your shit, because we can't take a risk with like letting someone in who might not be qualified. Now, I don't believe affirmative action in the way that we're talking about it lets in unqualified people, but a quota system might. Now, people think affirmative action and quota system are the same thing. It's not. There have not been any quota systems anywhere in the country ever since that case.
Right. And to add to that, in 2003, the court struck down the University of Michigan's use of a system that awarded quote unquote points to minority applicants, arguing that it went too far, but did affirm Bach's central finding that schools could use race as one of other admission factors. The court in 2016 again upheld race-conscious admissions in a challenge backed by Bloom to the University of Texas policies. Interesting.
Cool. So yeah, with my point about, major and, whether or not it's an impacted major or unimpacted major, to me, that also is about how you run an undergraduate school, the entirety of your undergraduate education, because you want people to come out level-headed. If you only let in the kids who applied to these impacted majors and only had, a perfect score on the SAT, rather than letting in this kid who maybe missed 2 questions on the SAT, if you only let in, if you just take let's say we're only letting in 2,000 kids, and we let in only the top 2,000 who, based on their grades alone, because people think that's how college admissions works. That's not. But we're only letting in the top 2,000 with their grades. The overwhelming majority of those students are going to be selecting the same 3 or 4 majors. It's kind of like the whole power law, 80-20. Like 80% of your students are selecting 20% of your majors, right? And so there literally would not be a need to have a fucking history program because there's only 5 students that are that want to major in history if that's the way you're doing it. There wouldn't be a need to have an African American studies program or a Chicano studies program or a Celtic studies program if that's what you're doing, or even an art history program if that's the way you're doing it, because there'd only be 1 art history student. There'd only be 2 theater students. You literally would not have a reason to have these faculty members. You would literally just be a college that focuses on these specific STEM fields. And guess what? We already have those. It's called Caltech. We already have those. It's called MIT. We already have those. Go to Caltech if you only want to go to a school that just has these things. But you know what's really cool about undergraduate education is you can major in physics, have these great grades and everything, but you can take some really cool history classes. You can take some really cool English classes. You could take an African American studies or Celtic studies class as well.
True.
But that's why you weigh majors and stuff like that. That's why major is such a big deal. And that is why it's harder if you're applying to a super impacting major like econ, physics, etc., versus applying to Celtic studies. That doesn't mean you get in as an unqualified student, though. That just means you're not competing against as many people. So statistically, the stats are just on your side. That's all it means. You're competing against 100 people instead of 10,000.
Well, it's an interesting point that you make, because according to science.org, the controversy around affirmative action rests on 2 misperceptions, which you were speaking to. One is the causation fallacy, the common yet mistaken notion that when members of advantaged groups are denied admission to a selective university or passed over for a job or promotion in favor of underrepresented minority candidates, that the cause is because of affirmative action. California Supreme Court Justice Goodwin Liu has argued that the real effect of affirmative action programs is too small to work to the disadvantage of Asian American admissions in any substantial way. And it's because, according to the data, according to the Week, Asians have noted that only less than 10% of them have ever thought that they were passed over for something, particularly related to college admissions, because of their race. So I found that pretty interesting.
Interesting. I don't know. I would love to see the data I was talking about before, because I don't think that data was actually presented when we actually control for the intended major of the applicant. And we really look at, give me an Asian student, give me a Black student that both applied to something like African American studies, an unimpacted major, and see what happened, and show me where their grades were at. Show me that. If you got an Asian student who did not get in, who had better grades, better extracurriculars, better personality, or throw the personality score out. We'll come back to that. But better essays, better grades, extracurriculars, essays, letter of rec, if applicable, and applied to the same unimpacted major as a Black student who got in despite being worse in all of those categories, then you can say, yeah, that person only got in because of affirmative action. And I will grant you that is not fair. I believe if you're literally going to give people a leg up doing the equivalent of what Michigan was doing, awarding points or anything like that, if anything, it should be based on socioeconomic status, not race. Because I know Black kids whose parents were fucking professors or executives at major companies in Dallas. We got a lot of companies that are headquartered there, that are vice presidents there, and they can get a congressperson to write a letter of rec to get their kid into Ivy League schools. I went to church with kids who ended up going to some of these Ivy League schools who were Black, who, if they got any kind of boost just because they were Black, that's bullshit, because their parents were already rich. They didn't need any help. Some white kid who's living in a trailer, that person needs a boost way more than a rich Black kid. If we're going to give anybody a boost, it should be based on socioeconomic status.
Well, it's interesting that you also say that, because the other fallacy presented in this argument is that the growth of the Asian American student population, specifically at Harvard anyway, and most of the universities, has occurred in tandem with the growth of affirmative action. So it helped them.
Yeah, if you're going to do the whole correlation is causation thing, then come on.
Right. But yet at the same time, 43% of white admissions were not really focused on, even though one of the Asian students who was a part of this lawsuit said that in the lawsuit, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I have just downloaded, and we can have a follow-up discussion on it after I read the whole thing, which I will.
Mm-hmm.
He said that in their argument, they did go after both affirmative action and legacy admissions. But for some reason, we're only hearing more about the affirmative action part.
Because that's all the ruling came out on. The ruling,
right.
Trust me, if the ruling took down legacy admissions, we'd be talking about it as well.
Right. We'd have known. So I'm thinking perhaps on our regroup, what I can do is, if it's of interest, I'll read the conclusion of the argument presented in the final document that was presented by the court.
Yeah. Let's do a quick wrap up on personality score, because that seems like it was based on interviews, and it seemed like the personality scores that they were giving to Asian students, specifically Harvard, were very low, and then personality scores that they were giving to other students were very high. There were a lot of Black students who had very high personality scores.
This is something that Forbes talks about. You are right. Allegedly, according to Forbes, also the reason that it was harder for Asians to get into Harvard is that there was something called a quote unquote personal ratings, a subjective evaluation of personal qualities. And on average, Asian Americans scored significantly lower than their white counterparts. Mm-hmm. According to the federal judge, Allison Burroughs, the court concluded that the data demonstrated a statistically significant and negative relationship between Asian American identity and the personal rating assigned by Harvard admission officers, holding constant any reasonable set of observable characteristics. However, the judge also held that the plaintiffs could not prove that the lower personal ratings are the result of animus or ill-motivated racial hostility towards Asian Americans by Harvard officials.
Okay.
Maybe they just ranked lower, period. I don't know.
See, and so I was going to say, I cannot tell people from the Asian community not to feel some type of way about that, because I know I would if I saw that.
Absolutely. That actually sounds both insulting and ridiculous.
And kind of gaslighting. Really? Oh, it's not because you're Asian. It's because all of you just don't have personality. All of you, I get it. Kids are going to show up stiff, and I get it. Kids, put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform well in those interviews, and so maybe they come off a bit stiff. And I don't know what else goes into the personality score, but you don't really, if it's a crazy gap between them and everybody else, like really you're going to tell them that that doesn't have anything to do with being Asian? You can't tell Asian people not to feel a type of way about that. Mm-mm.
Absolutely. That sounds like trash, to tell you the truth, that there was even like is there a congeniality contest that I'm unaware of? Is there, and then what? Black people go in and then they score off the charts on the personal ratings, or are they too over the top?
Right. See,
so what's the middle line?
Being white?
I don't know. Right. Yeah, so what's the middle line then? Being like them?
Yeah. Like that's interesting to me. Like that might be how they're applying affirmative action. Like, we're just going to give this Black kid a boost. Like, it's interesting. Like, show me, are we seeing kids with like dramatically like just unqualified scores, but then they're getting in because their personality score was so high? I hope that's not the case.
Yeah, but at the same time, we can't put everything just on grades. There are brilliant people in the world who did not test well, or did not read, or didn't do well in school, or who dropped out, or who were mediocre students, but, came up with brilliant writings or philosophy. So there is something to be said about not just looking at test scores and grades. There are artists who can't, form a sentence, but can create some of the most beautiful sculptures, or invent things, or paint things, or create things in a way that moves us. And if these things matter as well, then I don't think that it's fair to say the only way you should be able to get into these schools is because of grades. Because we know disproportionately African-American communities have been disenfranchised from education for a lot of different reasons. Economically, culturally, there's a whole slew of reasons that we can go through. Lack of accountability, we can get into that. But the point is that there has been a history of inequity in education. At the same time, there is no doubt in my mind, Asian kids study their fucking asses off.
Yeah.
For the most part, not every single one on the planet, but broad strokes, Asian American kids, or at least the Asian American kids I've come across, and even the ones who are first generation, like many of my peers are diligent about school in ways lots of us aren't. When I first got to Berkeley, I was shocked at how many kids had already not only gotten the books for the class for the semester, but had read it already. I was still looking for the bookstore, and I'm a diligent student. but they're not fucking around because some of them are coming from countries that this is it. This is their Willy Wonka golden ticket, and they be blowing it for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I respect that hustle. How can you not?
That.
How can you not?
And there are some people that will say, like, even if Black kids went to shitty schools, what does that have to do with your grades? Because if you work your ass off at the shitty school, if anything, you should be able to stand out more. I think, unfortunately, what actually happens is if you're a Black kid at this shitty school and you really take your education seriously, motherfuckers decide to start fucking with you.
Right.
They want you to let them copy your homework. They want to cheat off you. And if you don't,
they clown you.
Beat up. They're going to start fucking with you. You know what I mean? Like you get social pressure from the culture.
Right.
To like diminish yourself, to hide your light, to hide your brilliance. You get told you're acting white. Yeah, right. Acting white. Talk about it.
Right. And that's not how immigrant communities view education of any race. They don't look at it as acting white. They look at it as getting an education, period. Nor do they expect all of your learning to occur in the classroom. They are willing and prepared to work with their kids at home. And they expect their kids to work on their work at home. All they expect the teacher to do is give them the information that the kid needs to be successful in the classroom with the instructions on how to do it. And most immigrant families will tell you they expect their kids to sift through all that at home. The pressure is not on the teacher, it is on the family. And immigrant families take on that responsibility as part of their transition to this country. It's a no. And every immigrant kid will tell you that. There is no, I'm not going to school today. I don't feel well. You don't even think about saying that to your parents. There is no option. There is, my immigrant kid friends and I, we laugh when we hear like our counterparts will be like, I'm not going to school today. I got a headache. We're like, what? You can say that to your parents?
I got a headache. Wow. Yeah.
Bro, I had 8 years of perfect attendance at school when I was a kid.
You better, yeah.
My parents were like, vomit at school. Don't they got bathrooms?
They got. You better take some Pepto-Bismol or some Pedialyte and keep it pushing.
I mean, they were like, what are you going to do at home? They're like, you're just going to sit there sick. So sit at school sick. That's how immigrants think. Either way, you're just sitting. Like, it's not like you're like plowing the soil with a mule. You're sitting, right? Well, sit with some tissues in the back of the room.
There you go.
And suck it up, Buttercup, on this episode of Raw Food.